Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings and welcome to the first of our two lectures on the new St. Peter's Basilica complex in Rome, 1506 to 1667, what the human spirit is capable of achieving. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Christopher Longhurst to you. He's a New Zealander who's recently returned to New Zealand, having spent many years in Rome where he studied for his doctorate and worked at the Vatican Museum as a lecturer and docent. Through his interdisciplinary studies in the fields of theology, art and art history, he brings to his presentations not only a broad knowledge and understanding of the subject, but also a great love and passion for the art he worked with, as those of you who have been to his previous lectures will know. So, without more ado, Chris, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Just by way of introduction, this is part one of a two-part presentation on the Basilica of St. Peter, and today we're going to look at a little bit of the history of St. Peter's and the construction of the Basilica of St. Peter and the architecture, and then next week we're going to look at inside St. Peter's at the artworks. And the title is the New St. Peter's Basilica Complex, Rome, New St. Peter's Basilica. The word new is telling because St. Peter's was, as a basilica, was begun in the early 16th century, and that for us is over 400 years ago, so it might seem strange to refer to St. Peter's Basilica as new. So what do I mean by new? I'm not going to directly answer that question because hopefully at the end of this presentation, perhaps next presentation, it'll be quite obvious why new. And also why St. Peter's Basilica? One could say, well, why not St. Peter's Basilica? But what I mean by asking that question is what is special about the Basilica of St. Peter that attracts people from all over the world, from every walk of life, from every background, from every culture and from every religion? What is it about St. Peter's that has founded an entire industry called the Fabbrica di San Pietro that stems from the maintenance of St. Peter's Basilica? What is it that attracts commercial centers to focus on bringing people to St. Peter's? There's something more, I will argue, that St. Peter's Basilica has than the average great architectural complex. Why not, for example, the Taj Mahal or the Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's in London, which are equally great buildings? But there's something special about St. Peter's which I will argue makes architecture sacred, not just because of the ceremonies that take place there, but also because of some historical event that's directly linked to St. Peter's. And what I'm also going to argue in the presentation is that St. Peter's Basilica is more important than Vatican City. That is, Vatican City, the reason why Vatican City exists is because of St. Peter's Basilica. And we'll look shortly at why St. Peter's Basilica exists as well. So the raison d'etre of Vatican City is St. Peter's Basilica. And if you live in Rome today, Romans use the term Vatican City or the Vatican and St. Peter's interchangeably. What I mean by that, if you go to Rome today and you visit the Vatican, you may be going only to St. Peter's Basilica, or if you say you're going to St. Peter's Basilica, you may not be going to the Basilica but to the Vatican. So the terms St. Peter's and Vatican City are often used interchangeably today. And I'll explain why shortly. But before we start, I'm going to give an overview of St. Peter's and then come back and look at some details. But before I do, I'd like to quote from an art historian from the last century, Oreste Ferrari, who wrote about the masterpieces of the Vatican. And He speaks of St. Peter's Basilica as if he were speaking of Vatican City and vice versa. And he says, and I quote, "To speak of St. Peter's Basilica is to speak of the Vatican. To speak of the Vatican is to speak of Rome. This is as true today as it has ever been in the past. It is much more than the center of Catholicism, because it has absorbed within it the great heritage of the classical world into which our own civilization still has its roots. St. Peter's Basilica, like the Vatican, like Rome of old, is in a sense communis patria, that is, the universal fatherland. It has become the richer for that, and it has suffered too. It has aroused passionate enthusiasm and love, and no less passionate hatred. Even for those who do not share the Catholic faith and have no contact with Western civilization, St. Peter's and the Vatican is still a symbol and a historical reality that must be taken into account. Therefore, whatever our point of view may be, when we speak about St. Peter's and the Vatican, we have to realize its unique quality in history. We have to enter into it, to think and feel ourselves into it. Even if we consider it only as a collection of buildings and works of art, we are confronted by a unifying vision of 2,000 years of Western culture, unquote. I would add another 500 years on to that, because shortly we'll see that the Vatican comes from probably the beginning of the Republican era of Roman culture, which is about 500 years before the Common Era, whereas it seems that Ferrari was dating it around the beginning of the Common Era. Quote, "Whether we come as pilgrims or visitors interested in art or culture, we come up against St. Peter's as an artifact of history. We can see how it grew, where it has been altered or destroyed, day after day and year after year. When we go into St. Peter's, we are immediately immersed in history. The centuries speak to us, and we can touch it, as it were, and we can touch the point of intersection between the ancient and the modern. And this is something that happens to everyone, irrespective of breadth or narrowness of their culture or horizon," unquote. So again, that was a quote from Ferrari on the Vatican and St. Peter's. And what he's touching upon is a reason why the Vatican exists, which is typical of many places in Rome. No one arbitrarily decided to build St. Peter's in this part of Rome. What we have here is an image of Rome. There's the Tiber River, which is what we had up here before. This is Rome today. There's the Tiber River. And this area here, if you look very carefully, where the light is, that part that goes around this old wall, which would come down just off and around down there, past that hall around there, is Vatican City State. And here's the Basilica of St. Peter. Now, it's built on the west bank of the Tiber River. And what happened, the reason why the Basilica is here is because in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, the Emperor Nero builds a hyperdrome, what is commonly called a circus, like a racetrack. And in the center of the circus is a medium strip, which you can see here. And in the center of the medium strip, right around there, is an obelisk. An Egyptian obelisk that the Romans would have brought out sometime probably during the reign of the Emperor Augustus. And it marks the center of the medium strip, and this is where the emperor would have been entertained by the racing of beggars, like little carts drawn by horses in chariot races around the medium strip. So this is the circus of the Emperor Nero. It's not the famous Roman circus, which was the imperial circus, but just the private circus of the Emperor Nero. Nero reigned from 54 until 68 of the Common Era, and unlike sometimes what we read, the Christians were not constantly persecuted from the time of their arrival in Rome up until the legalization of Christianity. But certainly Nero, even though historians are moving away from this interpretation today, Nero was one of the most fierce persecutors of the Christians, and that was probably more for political reasons than it was for what the Christians believed. The Romans were very, very tolerant of all different religions, but according to tradition, and arguably there are scholars who will argue about some of the historical facts, the identities and the dates of a lot of what I'm going to present today. What I'll try to give you, if I may, is what I would call the line of best fit, because when it comes to identifying dates in Rome, also interpretations of meaning of spaces and identities, it's very complex, and scholars will argue the identities of those places among themselves. And I'm certainly not wanting to bombard you with a lot of dates and names, but I'll give you what I call the line of best fit, navigating through the breadth of the history of Rome, which basically, according to tradition, places the death of the leader of the Christian community in Rome sometime between the fire of Rome, the Great Fire of Rome, which was 64 AD, and the end of Nero's reign, which was 68 AD. So during those 4 years, apparently, the leader of the Christian community in Rome, who is St. Peter, was put to death, and there's documentation that talks about his crucifixion taking place at the foot of the obelisk. I'm not going to touch upon the verification of these documents. We can all do that on our own in our own time. But if that's where the obelisk stood, then Peter's crucifixion took place around about here. And in my opinion, based on what I've studied, it wouldn't have been a great event, because crucifixions took place all the time, especially during Nero's reign. He was staging crucifixions here for the celebration of his own anniversary. The Romans liked bloodshed. Probably one of Peter's followers, I believe it may have been an apostle, a disciple of St. Peter by the name of Marcellinus, takes Peter's body down from the cross. It may have been hung upside down. Again, tradition believes that it was. There is evidence to support that. But the body was taken down from the cross and buried on the side of the road. Now, here you see the road, the Via Cornelia, that you can still visit today when you go underground. There's the Via Cornelia. Here's the circus. That's what the circus basically would have looked like sometime after Nero. There's the obelisk. There's the medium strip. There's the circus. That was added by the early Christian community to mark the place where the death of St. Peter took place. Now, if you take the body down from here, walk across here, apparently around about there, the body was interred into the ground, the body of St. Peter, and there was a red stone that was placed over there to mark the place where the apostle was, in between two mausoleums. This is what we call a necropolis. This is Nero's necropolis. There's no catacomb at the Vatican. A catacomb is a Christian cemetery. Pagan Romans buried their dead in a necropolis, necropolis, city of the dead. So it's quite mistaken to refer to the catacombs of St. Peter's, but you hear it all the time, because you go down today to this ground level. When you go underground in Rome today, you're not technically going underground from Roman times. You're going down to various ground levels, because St. Peter's Basilica, the new basilica, is built over the old basilica, which is built over all of this. Because the Romans simply knocked down buildings, filled in and built on top. So you have these mausoleums in the necropolis under the present basilica. But if you look very carefully, right here there's a road, and that's called the Via Cornelia. So you have the necropolis on the northern side of the Via Cornelia and the circus on the right side of the basilica. I beg your pardon, of the circus. Now, cutting through a lot of the history, during the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, it's believed that Diocletian, also being a persecutor of the Christians, Diocletian had the bones of St. Peter dug up and to, like the other leaders of the Christian martyrs who were leading the Christian community in Rome at the time, the bones in their graves were dug up and thrown into a common pit. The Emperor Diocletian reigns from around 296 to 304, I believe. Now, apparently the Christian community, before Peter's bones are dug up, take Peter's bones and as a decoy place some kind of animal bones on the grave of St. Peter and hide Peter's bones in a catacomb in Rome known as the catacomb of San Sebastiano on the Appian Way. And this is important because when the bones of St. Peter were interred into the catacomb of St. Sebastian, a little brick encircling the body into the locus of the catacomb had written on it in Greek, "Peter is here, Petros eni." And that's so that the Christian community who wanted to go and respect the grave of St. Peter knew where the body was. Now, that's important because after Diocletian's fierce persecution of the Christians, the emperor that followed Diocletian, his name was Constantine, and he was a co-emperor at the time who defeated the emperor Maxentius, and already members of Constantine's family were Christians. So one of the first things Constantine does is legalize Christianity. In my opinion, he's protecting his mother, St. Helena the Great of Constantinople, more than anything else perhaps, and also his daughter, because they were practicing a religion in Rome that was technically illegal, the Christian religion. So Constantine, with the Edict of Milan in 313, legalizes Christianity. Whether he believes in the Christian cult or not is a question still of speculation, even though, of course, Christian tradition presents him as the Christian emperor. Funnily enough, the Roman Catholic tradition doesn't recognize him as a saint, as the Byzantine does. But this is important. One of Constantine's most obvious attributions to his belief and support of Christianity was the fact that on this very site he builds the first St. Peter's. Now note here, with the demolition of the circus, the obelisk is still standing. What Constantine builds, see the obelisk, it's still there, is what we call either the old St. Peter's Basilica or simply the Constantinian Basilica. This is the first St. Peter's, and it's probably more of a basilica architecturally than the present St. Peter's Basilica, because it has what's called the Stoa Basileum, which is like a royal hall for a king. It doesn't have, basilicas technically as architectural complexes do not have a dome, and they do not have a transept. This building is kind of more like a basilica architecturally than most basilicas in Rome, because it simply has the nave, the strong central part here, the two side aisles, the triumphal arch, and the apse. So actually this building, St. Andrew's, is conforming more to what we call a basileum, or a basilica, which is a royal hall in ancient Greek times, which the Romans used for municipal buildings, which the Christians use for worship. So here you have the basileum of Constantine, the two side aisles, and another side aisle on both sides which form lateral chapels, and here you have the transept, the courtyard, and the steps. Ladies and gentlemen, this building was built by Constantine in the early 4th century. It's still standing. Moving now to the topic of our presentation, it's still standing in the 15th century. Over 1,000 years later, the old Basilica of St. Peter's is in need of repair. Can you imagine, though, what took place in this building from an architectural and historical point of view from the time of its conception up until its demolition? Again, we're looking at 1,000 years of history. And I would love to go in to talk about some of the things that were inside here, but just if you've heard of names like Giotto, for example, works of art by Giotto, works of art, he's a master Giotto of the early Renaissance, one who might arguably move the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. Masterpieces by Giotto, destroyed by the architect who builds the new St. Peter's. Works by Masaccio, Masolino, tombs of emperors, the founder of the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne, crowned on the altar stone in the old St. Peter's Basilica. Now, granted, the basilica is in need of restoration, and that, I believe, was the intention of Pope Nicholas V, who proposes the restoration of the old St. Peter's around 1447. Nothing really happens until Julius II becomes Pope in 1503. He's a name that's worth remembering. Pope Julius II, Giuliano della Rovere. He was Pope between 1503 and 1506. Certainly one of the names worth remembering if you are interested in the Pope's contribution to culture and civilization. He certainly doesn't take his name after Pope Julius I. He takes his name after Julius Caesar. He's Julius II. That's the kind of ambitions he had for the Holy Roman Empire. Cutting through a lot of history, though, this Pope is important because he's the one who, as you may remember, commissions Raphael, who's the artist, if I may argue, not Michelangelo. Raphael is number one, the chosen artist of Pope Julius II, and he's the one who commissions Raphael to decorate his apartment. He's the one who commissions Michelangelo at the same time to do his tomb. And he's the one who commissions an architect, perhaps the finest architect of the rebirth of classical culture in Rome, the Renaissance, that the history of Rome saw. And his name was Bramante, Renato Bramante. He likes Raphael. He loathes Michelangelo. This dynamic is very important. Bramante got the plan to rebuild the old St. Peter's in 1506. This is where we start. 1506 with the new Basilica of St. Peter's, because Romans consider Bramante, who dies in 1514, guess what? Modern. Romans consider Bramante a modern architect. We, of course, consider him a Renaissance architect. The Renaissance for Romans is modern. Michelangelo is a modern architect for Romans. What Bramante did gave him the nickname by his protege and pupil, Raphael, the title Maestro Ruinante, Master Destroyer. His project was so magnificent that the pillars alone of the new project to rebuild the old St. Peter's would crush this building. The pillars alone, which we'll see shortly, have a diameter, 4 pillars holding up Michelangelo's dome. The pillars alone, and you know if you've been to St. Peter's, that you can't see them because they're too big. Meaning, you think you're looking at a wall, an interior structure of the basilica. It is just so vast. The diameter of each pillar is over 62 feet in diameter, which are holding up Michelangelo's dome, which we'll come back to shortly. But Bramante tears down the old St. Peter's. Just quickly moving on, there you have the old basilica, St. Peter's, and this is the outline of the new basilica, and there you have the circus. I won't spend too much time on that. There you have it again. There's the transept, the old St. Peter's, the new St. Peter's, and the circus where the obelisk stood. This is important. This is a plan of Bramante's idea, the floor plan of what Bramante conceived for the building of the new St. Peter. It's called a Greek cross, or a Greek cross cruciform, meaning each axis is equidistant. So it's unilaterally symmetrical. It's symmetrical on the diagonals, and it's symmetrical on the vertical and the horizontal axes. So this is what Bramante conceived of. These are the pillars in the plan. These 4 pillars, we'll look at shortly, hold Michelangelo's dome. Bramante begins the building of St. Peter's using, of course, what the Romans perfect, which is an arch. You can imagine each of these pillars are connected by an arch, and they're distributing the weight of the entire building, pushing on one another as an arch does. The neat thing about an arch, as I'm sure you can understand, is that it distributes weight. So if I am a column and then there's a column over there and we're connected by an arch, it doesn't matter how far apart we go from one another, the arch will just grow. Like that column there and that column there supported by that arch. You could move those columns like a rainbow and the arch will just grow and distribute weight. The arch concept that Bramante uses is very important for the beauty and the size, which I'll get to shortly, of St. Peter's, because the space inside St. Peter's is extraordinarily unifying because of the arch. And what we have to realize, which we don't when we go inside there, because everything's so related to it, all the parts are related to the whole. So what seems in relationship to another part small, out of context or out of that relationship is huge. Meaning, for example, just the altar is so large that it doesn't seem large in proportion to the arch that's over top of it. Everything's in harmony. And the problem with St. Peter's Basilica, when you go to Rome to see it, there's nothing really around it that's large enough to compare it with anything else. So you do lose, unless you study it, the scale of the Basilica. Because I won't bring it up right now, but you can have a look on one of the images on the handout there. From the floor to the top of the dome, you're looking at a building that is over 465 feet. Soaring from the ground up to the top. You're looking at the equivalent by our standard of a 46-story building built using stone masonry. Let me rephrase that. We can soar buildings into the sky today, as you know, skyscrapers, and they're quite impressive. But the spaces inside those buildings are small. Just take any skyscraper and divide it. When you walk inside St. Peter's, the entire space is open. There's this extraordinary theocentricity that even to the untrained eye directs you in and up. And that's just in the nave. So we're looking at a building that is built in the 16th century using just block upon block of travertine stone masonry, in a space that is entirely open, like this, but enclosed. Even the Colosseum is not enclosed, at least not with a vault. So that the scale of St. Peter's is very deceptive, and I'll get to that shortly. But when Bramante dies, not a lot had been done, and even the demolition of the old basilica is a process that takes a lot of time. But this is Bramante's floor plan, and when Bramante dies in 1514, guess to whom he gave his plan to be completed? Raphael. Bramante has a problem in conceiving how he could build the dome. Bramante was studying the Pantheon dome, and if you've been to Rome or you've seen the Pantheon, you might remember that the Pantheon dome, the Pantheon is the building in Rome that is dedicated to all the saints. Today was dedicated to all the gods. So all the gods become all the saints on the 1st of November 608, I think it was, transforming the pantheon, pan, many, theos, gods, into all the saints. Anyway, either way, that's a problem with Rome. Call it the Church of all the Saints, or call it the Roman Pantheon. Depends whether you're looking at it from a historical Roman pagan point of view, identity, or a modern Christian interpretation, identity. It doesn't matter. It gets all mixed up and context becomes important. But the Pantheon is a drum. And inside the drum is the dome. Bramante wants to bring that dome out of the drum and sit it on the drum. Can you imagine the weight of the dome is being supported by the drum in the Pantheon? There's a wonderful discussion between Michelangelo and Bramante and Raphael and Antonio di Sangolo about how they could raise conceptually the Pantheon up on top of the basilica, the new basilica, and get the dome out of the drum and set it on the drum so people can see it. Michelangelo proposed a plan. This is still Bramante's floor plan, and that was the design, the model of Bramante. As you can see, the dome is more what we call hemispherical, like half of a sphere. That was never achieved. This was only a model which in itself took 3 years to build for Bramante's dome on top of St. Peter's. When Bramante died, he gave his plans to Raphael. Raphael departs from the Greek cross, and as you can see, Raphael's plan is a Latin cross, which is bilaterally symmetrical on the vertical axis there. Michelangelo says, "How dare you?" Michelangelo accuses Raphael of quote, departing from the truth. Because Michelangelo, of course, being a classicist in a certain way, prefers the unilateral symmetry of Bramante's floor plan. Anyway, little work was done. Demolition continued of the old Basilica under Bramante, and I beg your pardon, under Raphael, until Raphael's death. Raphael died on his birthday at the age of 37 in 1520. So you're only looking at from 1514 to 1526 years of work when Raphael is in charge of the new St. Peter's complex and also in charge of the Fabrica of San Pietro at the time. I shouldn't say this, but I'm convinced that Michelangelo was not displeased at Raphael's death. He disliked Raphael immensely. Raphael was in competition, of course, with Michelangelo in the beginning, though clearly, based on other evidence, the respect that Raphael had for Michelangelo at Raphael's death in 1520 was extraordinary. Apparently, though, they never spoke. They held a silence campaign between each other up until their death. But still, can you imagine? Michelangelo is the senior of the two. Raphael is Michelangelo's junior by a good 7 years. Can you imagine how pained the ego of Michelangelo must have been to be passed over when Bramante died? But he was passed over when Raphael died as well. Michelangelo was not the favorite architect in his lifetime in the beginning. This changes, of course. Michelangelo lived to be 89. And what we see shortly, I'll come back to this, but when Michelangelo gets the commission, this is Michelangelo's dome. Michelangelo is 71 years of age when he finally gets the commission to continue building what Bramante, Raphael, and another architect by the name of Antonio di San Gallo had done all along. Can you imagine how he must have felt at the age of 71? He was angry that now in the twilight of his life he was being given something to do that he always wanted to do. And B, he was bored, utterly bored, because in his mind he had perfected everything that was great about the Renaissance. He had done it. But remember, Michelangelo is a sculptor. He throws out the plans of Raphael, and he goes back to the floor plan of Bramante, and here you have it. Here it is too. This is Michelangelo's floor plan, and as you can see, it's a Greek cross, but it's rather soft. It has what I would call a more delicate refinement of emotion in the way it revolves around the center. It's not as crisp as this, which is Bramante's again. So here's Michelangelo, but obviously Michelangelo respected Bramante. And you can see here that the plan, had it been finished as Michelangelo would have intended, the front is very close to the dome. If Michelangelo were alive today, he would not be happy with the finished product of St. Peter's, because Carlo Maderno, the next architect who works on St. Peter's, brings the nave so far forward. Ladies and gentlemen, length here of the Basilica is over 700 feet. The interior length is 649 feet. Just to give you an idea, 2 football fields would fit inside this. 2 football fields. And you don't feel that when you're down there in the nave. Once you come into this space, which opens up in the transept, there's an extraordinary feeling of space that you get there. But now here are the finished pillars, which again have a diameter of 62 feet, 649 feet here. Now, so if you're standing out in the piazza trying to see Michelangelo's dome, you can't, because the entire nave has been brought forward so far, and the facade is so high that you need to be so far back to see the dome. So, and that was not what Michelangelo intended with this. You could be standing down here and look up and see his dome soaring into the sky. The architect who comes after, who completes St. Peter's in a way, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, by building these arms here and ramping up the side walls here and lowering the space, is trying to raise the view of the dome so you can see it. By the way, Bernini, which I'll come to shortly, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, was quite critical of the work by Carlo Maderno as well. Here's Maderno's plan as well. Maderno does the facade, the beautiful facade. Good example of what I'm trying to say, because this photo was taken from in front of the obelisk, basically in the center of the piazza, and you can't see the dome. Now, however, most importantly about the dome, when Michelangelo gets the commission to build the dome, there's the dome from a view in the gardens behind, west of the Basilica. There's the dome from an aerial view too high for you to see it, in the sense that this was taken, of course, from another building far away with a good lens. They could see it high enough up. Oops. But I'm going to remain here for a while. That's a nice view of the dome too, because if we stay here, or perhaps there, the question becomes now, Michelangelo's work, even though he didn't live to see this finished, Michelangelo died in 1564, and what had been built in 1564 was simply the drum. But the architects who carried out the completion of the dome remained faithful to Michelangelo's design, and they were two masters in their own right by the names of Giacomo della Porta and Domenico Fontana. But the dome is Michelangelo's, let's argue. Even though he doesn't finish, the model that he had built was used, slightly modified by della Porta, but Michelangelo does achieve what he said to Bramante could be achieved based on his insight and intuition from a mechanical engineering point of view, which of course he wasn't, but he has raised the dome, and this is, if I may say so, a true dome, meaning it would be like an arch, a functional arch, which this is not. This is purely aesthetic in a space that's distributing weight, but there's no keystone up here, and there's no ribs up here of an arch that distributes weight into a space, which is what an arch does. This is a network of 16 arches in 3D, meaning it's working as an arch. And this is important because most of the domes you don't see throughout the world today are not real domes, like the Capitol in Washington, D.C. is not architecturally a real dome. And neither is Christopher Wren's dome in London, which I won't go into. Neither is the Duomo, arguably, an architectural dome. Because what the architect of the Duomo has done in Florence, Filippo Brunelleschi, has simply, it's like vaulted ribs on an octagonal tribune that are leaning on each other. But anyway, I won't go into that. What we have to try to grasp here, I believe, is the extraordinary ability of Michelangelo to raise the weight of not just the dome, but what's called the lantern, this 17-meter building up on top of what should be an oculus to let in light of the Pantheon. If you've been to the Pantheon, you know in the center of the Pantheon there's an eye that lets in light. So what does a lantern do? It lets out light. So Michelangelo blocks the oculus of the Pantheon, which inspires him, with the lantern, and he has these 16 ribs that are sitting on the drum. Now remember, if I were to ask you, what are you looking at, architecture or sculpture? This is important because I will argue Michelangelo is no longer in the Renaissance. Or what he does, he moves away from the canons of style of the Renaissance with his playing with Renaissance language and subverting the meaning of functional architectural morphemes, like the arch. See the arch? Questionably, it's not functioning, but it is a true arch. That is doing the complete opposite to what an arch should do. It's an added-on ornamental piece, not distributing any weight, and it's positive space as opposed to negative space. An arch is negative space. Michelangelo subverts the meaning of the Renaissance. See those columns? A column is supposed to hold something up, weight on the top. They're not even touching the drum. Those lovely twin columns, ornamental columns, and then he alternates an additive pediment, a Roman arch added on as a Greek pediment, triangular Greek pediment, Roman arch added on, ornamental columns. Arguably, you're looking at sculpture. Remember, Michelangelo is a sculptor, and this arguably becomes the precursor of a new style which the Romans ended up loving, which is highly criticized as fake in the beginning. Fake in the sense of not real architecture, fake in the sense of simply decorative, like the pearl of the oyster, which looks round when it's not, and looks smooth when it's not, and is good for nothing except to decorate, which is called barocco. Perle barocco. This is called perle barocco, from which we get the word in English, the Baroque. So one could argue Michelangelo, in the twilight of his age, has pushed the Renaissance into a new style which the Romans end up loving because it's theatrical, because it's ornamental, because it's entertaining, because it's soft, because it blurs that demarcation between the Renaissance and the Baroque with this ornamentation. My point is, we are looking at architecture, of course, and we are looking at a functional dome, but we are looking at much more. Michelangelo dies in 1564 as a Mannerist architect of his time, which has moved on after the Renaissance to become what becomes Rome's last great urban identity, the Baroque. If you go to Rome today, you go to a Baroque city. If you want to look at it as a artistic identity of a city. Of course, Rome is much, much more than that, but arguably its last great urban identity is the Baroque. Notwithstanding, of course, what Mussolini does with fascist architecture, but that's only in parts of the city. Rome is a Baroque dome. And Michelangelo dies working on this in 1564, but the dome was finally built during the pontificate of Pope Sixtus V around 1580, 1585. But again, as I mentioned, Della Porta remains faithful to Michelangelo's design. So you have Michelangelo's design sitting up on top of Bramante's Basilica. I think it's important also this is a view of the nave, and the distance from the center back would have been the same distance up until around about here. So this is where Michelangelo's facade would have ended. But you get a feel just looking down the nave of this wonderful unification of space where you have an arch within an arch within an arch. Look there, for example. Even again, to the untrained eye, this creates a sense of unity, which is what the Renaissance is wanting to achieve in certain architectural spaces, unlike the Greeks, who divide space. The Romans open space. So you have an arch within an arch within an arch within an arch. And over here you have an arch within an arch within an arch. This is all Bramante's concept of unifying space. You do feel it. These are not the pillars. of Bramante. The pillars of Bramante are down here, massive compared to Carlo Maderno's pillars here, in what you feel when you walk into St. Peter's as a typically Baroque space. You do feel that. A lot of ornamentation. These pilasters embedded into the pillar are actually faux. They're fake. They're not doing anything except looking lovely. But you do, and just from the floor to the vault, you're looking at 150 feet. So the equivalent to what would be a 15-story building just here. But when you go down into the dome, here, for example, you're looking southwest. These are Bramante's pillars. You can see a person down there, how small they are. So if you put that person in comparison to, for example, the diameter of this roundel here, ladies and gentlemen, the interior diameter of that roundel is 36 feet, meaning a 3-story house would fit inside that roundel. The letters here, I would fit inside that eye, or even that upright of the N. They're over 6 feet tall. But you lose that, as I mentioned, when you go inside St. Peter's, simply because of the scale. The building is all in proportion and in harmony. Those figures over there, for example, those bronze figures around the chair of St. Peter, which we'll look at in more detail next week, are about 15 times the size of the average human person. Here you see another angle of the high altar, the baldacchino over the high altar, with this unity of arches distributing weight. The pillar, one of the pillars of Bramante, and in the pendentives, the roundel there as well. Another view of the same concept, looking up into Michelangelo's dome. I'm trying to focus on the architecture more than the art here to give you an idea of the weight and the integrity of the architecture, which is functioning but is looking decorative at the same time. There you see the roundels, and you see the triumphal arches pushing on each other, distributing the weight into the entire complex. And there you have the interior of the dome as well. 16 ribs sitting on the tribune or the drum, and the decoration in each of these ribs, as in the roundels, is mosaic. These are all mosaics. Tiny pieces of cut glass, no more than a square quarter of an inch, decorating the interior of the Basilica. There's the model of St. Peter's. There are two, as you can see, there is a hemispherical dome within a parabolic dome. That's how Michelangelo works out when Bramante called him an arrogant fool for claiming that he could do it, raise the dome out of the drum and sit it on the drum. Technically, Michelangelo's dome is not a hemisphere. You can probably feel that when you see it. It's like an egg. It's more parabolic. What he's doing, rather than swing the ribs from every point of the circumference of the base of the drum, he has a diagonal going from the base of the drum, not the top of the drum, the base of the drum. He has a diagonal going through, if this makes sense. Can you imagine that chord there is perpendicular to that point? So the radius of Michelangelo's dome is at the base of the drum, not the top of the drum as Bramante would have envisioned it. So what he's doing, that hoop stress that thrusts out the weight, is being pulled down as if the ribs are leaning on one another. Bramante, the architect, was having trouble at working that out. Michelangelo, the sculptor, achieves it. Because with heavy buildings, as the cathedrals we see around Rome, they have buttresses holding up the walls. If you move those buttresses, the weight of the building is going to push out the walls, it's going to collapse. Again, the weight of the dome is sitting on the drum without buttresses, arguably, and the weight is not pushing out the drum. Michelangelo achieved it through this remarkable insight into understanding the hoop stress and the centrifuge and the dome within a dome, etc. But you can climb up between those domes today. There's steps taking you up through them that will take you into the Langturn, where there's a restaurant and a cafe. Literally, again, it's very, very large. It's much larger than it seems. We're running out of time. I realize, and I will end shortly, but here's a cross-section to give you an idea of the floor, of the ground level from Roman times, where the mausoleums of the necropolis are, that were built over by the old basilica, which is now the crypt of the new basilica. So this is the floor plan of the old basilica, and this is the new basilica to give you an idea up until at least the entablature of the interior. This is Gian Lorenzo Bernini's Baldacchino, and this is an aerial view of the mausoleums of the necropolis that would be inside here. Finally, I'll simply end with the contribution of Maderno and Gian Lorenzo Bernini. This is the facade, and it seems impressive. And I'm sure you've seen it already. And it's dedicated to to St. Peter. Along here, if you read, it says, Honorum Principis Apostolorum, in honor of the Prince of the Apostles. One might think you would read St. Peter, but following it, it reads Paulus Quintus, Paul V, Borghese, Roman. He was the Pope now who is ruling Rome from 1605 to 1621, and it's to him that some attribute the completion of St. Peter's. So you're looking, ladies and gentlemen, at a building that was started by Julius II in 1506, now being completed in the pontificate, Pontiff Dodici, in the 12th year of the reign of the Borghese Pope, 1612. So you're looking at 106 years to build St. Peter's. And that's a conservative estimate because some do not believe this is the end. Because the Basilica, technically, if you look at it, if you have to put a date on the completion of St. Peter's, most put it in the pontificate of another great pope by the name of Urban VIII, who was Gian Lorenzo, perhaps the greatest artist of the Baroque era, patron. And the Pope Urban VIII was the one who commissions Bernini to do the canopy, the high altar, the baldacchino, the bronze canopy, which looks like a Jewish chuppah that sits over St. Peter's. Technically, that's what we believe the attribution of date is to the completion during the reign of the Barberini Pope under the work of Gian Lorenzo Bernini. But no, I would still beg to argue with that, because then Bernini gets another commission to do the piazza. This lovely colonnade here, these colonnades here, are the work of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, perhaps one of the greatest contributions of the Baroque as well. And that's perhaps when we consider it completed, when Bernini adds on the arms of St. Peter, because they do look like the arms extended out to embrace the people who come in. And that was one of his ideas. Actually, it wasn't his idea, it was his patron's idea. Bernini's floor plan for this was actually not round, it was square. It was the Pope Fabio Chigi, who became Pope Alexander VII, who wanted this idea of the arms embracing the people, the arms of St. Peter, or perhaps the arms of the mother, if you interpret St. Peter's as Mater Ecclesia, Mother Church, the arms of the mother embracing her children. That's when perhaps I would consider the new St. Peter's completed, and that's why I give it the date 1667, because that was the end of the reign of the Chigi Pope, who, let's argue, completes the building of the new St. Peter's with the contribution of Bernini. Last of all, what Bernini says about Carlo Maderno's work. There's this wonderful facade. I mean, it is lovely from an architectural point of view. It is Baroque. There's a lot that we can say about this that identifies it as a Baroque work of art. Guess what? Bernini, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who's the antithesis of Michelangelo. Everything that Michelangelo was not, apart from being great, Bernini is. Bernini is charming. He does what he's told. He has people working under him. He gets a lot done. He follows his commissions. He mixes with the right people. He's clean. He's handsome. He wears perfume. Michelangelo is the opposite of all of that. Grumpy, dirty, doesn't do what he's told, signs commissions, goes off and does what he wants, sacks the people who are working for him, takes too long, changes his mind, doesn't wash, smells bad. Anyway, my point is, what does Gian Lorenzo Bernini say about the facade, which we celebrate today? He says it's boring, truncated, flat, and monotonous. I'm like, wow, when I first read that, boring, flat, truncated, monotonous, this is quite an insult to the work of Carlo Maderno, also a great architect in his own right. But what Bernini has in mind, of course, is what Michelangelo intended, which we do not have, which is this spectacular unification of space by which the dome has this theocentric thrust that invites the audience in, the public in, to, in a certain way, it has that definition, that incarnation, if I can use the word of beauty, id quod placet visum, that which pleases upon being seen, but not seen with the eye, seen with the mind, by which it inspires and conduces finally to worship, which may be the end-all sum of architecture that has been built by a patron that has a religious ideology. One could use the word propagation. But I understand what Bernini means when he criticizes the work of Carlo Maderno. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.